now, because we all know that the effects of climate change are increasingly being felt across the globe, and as these severe weather events become more frequent, it's more important than ever that we understand and improve our capacity to cope with and then rapidly recover from shocks. And I'm sure that you're all very familiar with the measurement of resilience in terms of hard metrics like income level and the state of a country's infrastructure. But at the foundation, we really questioned whether this helped us to understand what was happening on the ground in people's lives and give us really meaningful insight into how resilient people really are. The foundation, Lloyd's Register Foundation, is a global safety charity. We invest in research, in education and in innovation programmes across the globe. And we've got a long-held interest in resilience and also in the public understanding of risk. And we very much feel that risk and resilience go hand in hand. And if we're better prepared to deal with the risks that we face, and we understand better how those risks are understood, then we can be better prepared to withstand shocks and stresses. And so we brought those two domains together of resilience and public understanding of risk in our 2021 World Risk Poll. And the poll is a very novel data set that helps us to understand how resilient people across the world feel, and we combine that with their with insight into their experience of and perspective on the risks that they face in their daily lives. And the data is freely available. We've made the World Risk Poll available so that action can be taken to improve people's outcomes in relation to their safety across the globe. And so before diving into the results, I'll just say a little bit more about the World Risk Poll and how it's administered. We commissioned Gallup, the global polling firm, to conduct the World Risk Poll on our behalf. In 2021, they polled in 121 countries, 125,000 interviews, so at least 1,000 people interviewed in each country, face-to-face and also some CATI, so telephone interviewing. And the important points to make are that the polling happens in countries where little or no official data on safety exists across the world. And so we asked some general questions about people's feelings about risk and safety, and then also some very specific questions about particular modules. And so we've, in addition to our resilience work, also launched reports across the last 6 months on risk and safety during COVID, on violence and harassment at work, and then on data privacy and artificial intelligence. So the polling is really, really broad across a whole range of issues. And then I'm going to talk to you today about the specific results that we've generated from the questions that we asked about disaster resilience. Now, there was an issue displaying my PowerPoint slides, unfortunately, so this is just a PDF. But if you go onto our website, Lloyd's Register Foundation website, and look at our World Risk Poll website, and then look at the Resilience Index, you'll see that this data spindle here represents the 121 countries that were polled in 2021. And we know that resilience is driven by a whole range of factors and the interplay of those factors, and some of those relate to our individual or our family circumstances, and others are set at a community or a societal level. And so this data spindle here is made up of the results from questions that we asked across the 4 dimensions of individual, household, community and society. And so just to give you an example of the kind of questions that are included in the index, we ask about an individual's sense of agency, so whether they have a plan in case of disaster. And we also ask how long they and their family could survive if they lost all of their, or how long they could cover basic needs for if they lost all of their income. And so those 2 questions come into the individual element of the resilience index. At the community level, we ask about social capital, so whether neighbours care about their well-being, and also about their local infrastructure, so the extent to which they're satisfied with education, healthcare and roads. And so we've brought those questions together to create this new resilience index, and you can have a play around with it on our website, and it's really available. So please do let us know what you think, and how you might be able to use it, and also how you think we might be able to improve it. And so now I'm going to take you through some of the key findings from the poll. And this graph here shows a selection of countries that that we know through talking to colleagues at the World Bank or are of interest to colleagues at the bank. And we've selected countries here that are at the highest and lowest ends of the resilience index. And we can see from our index that, that from a regional perspective, Australia and New Zealand, North America, Southeast Asia and North and Western Europe are the most resilient, and that countries in Central and Western Africa display the lowest levels of resilience. That probably doesn't come as a surprise, but the important thing is that because we can then drill down at a country level into the data, this then enables us to, for example, measure the gap in resilience between high and low income countries, also to learn from the most resilient countries. So actually, are there some low income countries where there are particularly strong elements of resilience across those 4 metrics. We can then encourage the targeting of investment to the places that display the least resilience, and also then build on the strengths within individual communities where resilience is displayed. And we can also measure progress, and we will be repeating the questions that make up our resilience index in the 2023 World Risk Poll, which is currently in translation with Gallup, and we'll be going into the field very shortly. And just to give you an example of the kind of things that are driving the figures that you see here, you can see that Vietnam scored quite highly with a resilience score of 0.8. Vietnam as a country scored particularly highly on the society dimension, with strong perceptions of government support and also confidence in institutions, but actually the weakest element on the resilience measures in Vietnam was at the community level. However, if you look at Taiwan, which had a resilience index score of 0.67, there were lower levels of societal resilience, but a very strong community level. So that just gives you an indication of how we can use this data to compare. So now I'm going to go on to talk about different results within the poll. And as I mentioned, it's not particularly surprising that high income regions and countries scored highly on the resilience index, but what we can also use the index to demonstrate is the strength in other dimensions that can help some countries to make up for example, lower levels of economic security or poor infrastructure. And this chart here illustrates the high levels of community support that are seen in low-income countries, with over 1/3 of respondents, so 35% of people in high-income countries, in low-income countries, saying that their neighbours care about them a lot. Whereas if you look in high-income countries, that figure falls to 20%. So Indonesia had the highest level of community support globally at 58%, followed by Mali at 57%, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, we find upper middle income country Mexico at 8% and Thailand at 13%. And this was one of the most interesting sets of findings from the poll, looking at levels of community support in different countries and regions around the world. So I'm now going to go on to talk about 2 other indicators of resilience that showed high levels of variation between countries we polled, and those are access to the internet, which is shown on the slide here, and also then I'll go on to talk about financial security. So the poll results show that people with internet access are far more likely to say that they feel able to protect themselves and their families in the event of a disaster. You can see a 6 percentage point difference there at the global level. And that holds true regardless of country income level. But then if you look at the data on the right-hand side here, you can see that in low-income countries, people typically lack the disaster lifeline provided by the internet, with barely more than a quarter, so 27% of people in low-income countries saying that they did have access to the internet, compared to more than 9 in 10 or 91% in high-income countries. And so then going on to talk about financial security, we've got quite a unique measure of financial security included in the World Risk Poll, asking people how long they could cover their basic needs for if they lost all of their income. And of course, we know that income levels vary, but the World Risk Poll data shows us that on a very human scale, exactly what this means for individuals around the world. So 34% of people globally could cover their needs for less than a month, and that includes more than 1 in 10 or 12% who said that they could only cover their needs for less than a week. And this financial vulnerability is highest in Southern Asia and in Northern Africa, right at the bottom of the chart here, where around half of people could only cover their basic needs for less than a month, and that included about a quarter of people in these countries, in these regions, who could do so for less than a week. And then this next slide just fades out the regions that aren't as greater interest for World Bank colleagues, just to show you there the regions that are of greatest interest to you, and just to pull out a few country level figures. Within the responses in Egypt, 37% of people said they could cover basic needs for less than a week. But looking at Tanzania, only just under 2% of people said they could cover basic needs for less than a week, and around 10% for less than a month. And that's a really interesting finding. And only Norway, Sweden and Iceland fared better than people in Tanzania in relation to their financial security. So a bit more digging into the data there needed to understand, digging into the context to understand the drivers for that. And we also asked within the poll about people's experience of discrimination, because we know that resilience can vary considerably within individual countries, and we found throughout our findings that particular groups of people are especially vulnerable in different countries. And so we asked about discrimination based on a range of factors, including sex, including whether an individual has a disability, including their religion, and we found that globally 1 in 5 people, or 21%, have experienced some form of discrimination. But there were some countries where levels of discrimination were exceptionally high. So you look at the countries on this map here, and in Zambia, for example, over half of the people living in Zambia reported experiencing some form of discrimination. And we know that discrimination is really important in relation to resilience, because it reduces community and social cohesiveness, and often then contributes to and then perpetuates inequality, reducing access to the most disadvantaged groups to economic opportunity, for example, improve social mobility, and then also the kind of benefits and other factors that can make people more resilient to adversity. So we also asked within the poll about the sources of information that people use and trust in the face of disaster, because we found in previous polls that this often varies, that people's trust in different information sources can vary by individual characteristics. And globally, we saw that local news media is the most trusted source of disaster information globally. That's stood at 31%. But in low-income countries, local religious leaders ranked second at 14%. And so putting those findings together, what we know about people's experience of discrimination, and then who they trust to provide essential information, we can see that it's really important that strategies to disseminate disaster information and improve resilience are both equitable and also inclusive. So I want to, before I finish, talk about resilience and natural hazards. So the World Poll also asked about people's experience of a disaster arising from natural hazards like severe weather or from earthquakes. And the data shows us that many countries with high experience of disaster are also those with low resilience, highlighting areas of vulnerability that need to be urgently addressed. And so the World Poll has given us a really ground level view on how vulnerability might be addressed, and it's really important that resilience is built in these areas where we know that a disaster is more likely to follow a natural hazard. So how can the World Poll data be used to influence action on resilience? Well, we believe that understanding perceptions of risk and the discrepancies between actual and perceived risk can support targeted policies and communication efforts. But the World Risk Poll is telling us something really fundamental about the likelihood of individuals and communities actually then taking action. And so this chart here shows that public perceptions of the threat of climate change are linked to their experience of severe weather, and suggesting then that people are likely to be more motivated to take action on climate change based on their experience of severe weather. And so the learning from that is that to adapt to climate change, we need to take into account and understand people's personal perceptions of resilience and feed those into broader calculations of risks and trade-offs that are made at an individual level, but also at a societal level. So there can be a really delicate balance, we know, between encouraging action and empowerment to address risk and creating a sense of helplessness and resignation on the other hand. And so we believe that this data can be used to better balance those outcomes. And we encourage the use of the World Risk Poll data to understand and learn from the strength of countries and different communities in relation to their resilience, and then also to design interventions that build on local strengths as well as addressing weaknesses. But of course, we know that resilience can be generic, and this isn't just about climate change. It's essentially for whatever comes next and whatever communities around the world need to be resilient to. And so the last slide that I'm going to leave you with is some links through here to visual snapshots of the World Risk Poll data. The one here is for Pakistan that brings together some of the questions that we asked within the poll and displays them visually. You can also download the full data set from the World Risk Poll website. And we have actually just closed our funding call to turn the World Risk Poll into action, but there will be other calls in future. So if you've got an idea about how the data can be used with a particular community to make a difference on a particular risk and safety issue, then please do keep an eye. You might want to sign up for our newsletter, and future funding calls will be advertised there. So I will take my slides off now, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Absolutely fascinating and surprising to me too. The one you highlighted on East Africa and the perception of financial safety in Tanzania, and I think the data you showed was East Africa broadly. I will turn now to, I see Joaquin has his screen up. I was about to ask Esha first. Esha, I believe, yeah, I see Esha's connected as well. I wanted to ask you both if there was any of these findings that was surprising to you. Maybe Joaquin goes first since you put on the screen, and then we go to Esha.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Sarah. I think this was a very enlightening presentation, and I was playing a little bit with the website. I will suggest everybody to do so. It's very user friendly and has a lot of things that you can start exploring. But I think that the presentation was great, and I was surprised with a couple of things. But let me just say first that I like very much the approach on the individuals. But the way that you did it, no, individuals, householding, community, and society, because we live in a society, and the index is by countries. However, the way that disasters occur at the individual level, no, and then it goes to the household, to the community, and the society gets impacted in a different way as the community and the individual, and I like that very much. And one of my surprises was this point that you were mentioning, the latest, no, the risk perception and the exposure of risk, and how this is affected by having had a disaster or not, no, and I think for our purposes, this is very important, because when we are deciding where to do the projects and how to do it, we tend to forget these 2 points. No, one is the perception of what can happen, and all of these climate related risks in communities or individuals that haven't had the experience, in Central America. I saw also, I work in LAC, Sarah, and I was just looking at a little bit on Central America, for example, because you had several of the countries there. And the risk in some of the countries, the perception has been related to disasters in the last decade. So there's a higher perception, but it was surprised that to see, for example, Honduras, which has been hit very much every 5 years, every 3 years, with big disaster and small disaster being in the lower part of the index. Because when we talk to the communities there, they definitely have been affected by the disasters, but also I felt that there's a more sense of resilience. No, so I think it's interesting to look at the data and the conversations we have with communities affected. But my point on this is how to bring communications aspect that will affect to the broader community at the individual levels. The other thing is highlighting this fact that community bonds are stronger in lower in this. I mean, and you see that in reality. I just want to make sure that, when you are in communities, coming back to the example in Honduras, you see that the bonding and the help that the communities provide to each other is very, very, very strong. So when we are designing our projects, I think it's a very interesting point to use this opportunity to strengthen those capacities at community level, because sometimes governments will arrive days, if not weeks, after a disaster. Highlighting two more things, maybe before I end, is the fact that infrastructure and not only internet, but in the index you highlight internet, and that is a very important point as well, because when we are discussing, and lately we're discussing more in multi-hazard early warning systems, and we are supporting buying radars, equipment, and all of these things. Nothing works if the message doesn't arrive to the community, to the individual. No, so I think taking into consideration this part on how people have or not have internet, ensuring that the messages, as well as you were mentioning with the aspects of gender inclusion and how to communicate, not only what to communicate and how to communicate. And just to finish, and I found that this is the part that I found it the most interesting, and I want to look at more is the whole aspect of financial vulnerability, because we have been developing a lot of adaptive social protection activities, which relate exactly with the question, how long can you survive without economic support? And COVID has been right there into these communities, because some of them pass several months without work, and in a big disaster for the community, which doesn't mean that it's a big disaster for the country. These aspects are very, very important. I will stop there, Niels.
Thanks a lot, Joaquin. Esha, any perspective from you on what you found, or if you found any of the findings surprising, and maybe also you could talk a bit about if you find the particular index a useful way of assessing resilience and vulnerability.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Niels. And it's such a pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks a lot for the fantastic presentation, Sarah. I really enjoyed reading the report as well. It's extremely unique. The data set is global, and of course, there are challenges, I imagine, even collecting this data, but it adds so much richness and perspective to the discussions that we're having today with respect to climate change and resilience, and particularly to account for how people perceive risk. So we're adding to the standard sources of data that we often use from censuses and so forth. But what this data set adds is this richness, I think, the perspective of people. So I really, it's very commendable. And I was speaking to some of my colleagues in the social inclusion team in the water practice where I sit. So I'm in the global water practice, and they've been working on the Eastern Africa resilience operation. And I know this is of great interest to them because they've been trying to develop a water resilience framework that they can use across countries in this regional operation. And they've been, discussing various frameworks that they can use. And so this one is very interesting to them. One of the aspects that they were also discussing was an indicator on self-perceptions of resilience, and to also see whether this has changed over time. So I would love to put you in touch with them, and I'm sure they would be interested to extend this discussion even further. So I just wanted to make a few key points and reflecting on the great presentation Sarah gave, but also how we think about resilience and adaptation, because I sit in the water practice and everything is really about adaptation. And we know that it's not just the climatic shock itself that matters, right? It's the vulnerability and the capacity to cope with that shock that ultimately leads to very different outcomes for different people. And I think this seems obvious, but I think it's really important to highlight as we also develop our climate change development reports at the World Bank. Oftentimes, we try to account for the overall cost of climate change in the macroeconomic model, but don't account for all of these distributional impacts. And it really makes a difference for poverty if just 1% of the population loses 50% of their assets in a flood, or if 100% of the population loses a small percentage of their assets, even though the overall cost in the macroeconomic model is the same. So I think this type of data set really, I think, highlights the importance of these distributional impacts. I also wanted to note that we often talk about the future progress is going to be threatened by climate change, no doubt, but also by social sustainability, and by showing how resilience is comprised by a variety, like a mix of individual, household, community, and societal factors is so critical, because it points out how less tangible social infrastructure and community support networks are also critical to prevent and mitigate harm in many parts of the world. So it gives you a very inclusive ground level view. And I think we saw this firsthand with COVID, as well as the floods in Pakistan. Communities are oftentimes the first order responders. And so we really need to strengthen investments along that pillar as well. I think in general, what we also learn from this is that hazards don't need to become disasters. It's not just about income. It's also not just about location. It's also not about how many disasters you've had in the past. It's really all of this together. And I think this framework also provides a voice to those who have not been heard. And I think what their perception is of risk provides sort of an equity-based lens to the problem. I think this is also an important discussion given the debate that we're having on loss and damages. The reason why I think these social sustainability indicators are so critical is because without trust, social cohesion, and how decisions are made, it's really difficult to put policies in place. And I was reading about sort of some of these aggregate indicators of social unrest and trust, and apparently social unrest has quadrupled since 1984. People who they feel they can trust has also declined. The inequality statistics are also rising, and I think all of this is highlighted in the risk poll that you've conducted, because we have to account for all of this. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to come together to also manage some of these global public goods problems that the bank is also thinking about when in terms of not just the country model investments, but also how do we manage global public goods. So I think this risk perception and perception of people is absolutely critical. I think that if we just think about how the role of inter and intra-household factors also play a role in managing climatic shocks. What the poll also shows us is that they are mediated by a range of other demographic variables, right? And gender, for example, critically shapes these risks and responses. And so I think these perceptions, they tell us and can help our operations and our colleagues who work on these climate resilience projects in terms of, why some people might choose to adapt while some may not, or don't have the ability to adapt. So, the initiatives to encourage adaptive behavior, they have to account not only for these perceptions of risk, but they also need to acknowledge that these perceptions, they differ based on social, economic, and personal factors, and therefore this can lead to very different behavioral outcomes to adapt or not. So I'll stop here just to say that I think this is a fantastic framing, and I think it will be very valuable to our colleagues who are working on a lot of climate resilience operations in many parts. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Isha. I will turn back to you in a second, Sarah. And there's a specific question from Josephine in the chat about, she's asking the question about security and disaster, asked if they felt that way because they had internet, question mark. So maybe you can address that specific question related to how the questioning was set up in the poll. And then if you want to reflect on anything that Joaquin and Esha just said, and then I'll do another round. There's another question or comment that I'll get back to. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just looking for so the question about security. No, it didn't in response to Josephine's question. So we're looking there at the correlation between how they felt and whether they had the internet, rather than asking them a direct question about whether access to the internet made them feel more prepared. Hopefully that's answered your question, Josephine, but if not, then please do pop a clarification into the chat. And then Niels, yes, thank you for the opportunity to respond to a couple of particular points that sprung to mind, although it's great to hear from both of the respondents, the discussants today, in terms of how valuable you feel this is. We've had quite a lot of work done with the World Risk Poll data on communication around climate change by an academic called Wendy Brun, who works out of the University of Southern California. I don't know if you're familiar with Wendy's work, but would certainly encourage you to have a look at some of her papers. And essentially, Wendy talks about the importance of anchoring the concept of climate change in people's experience of severe weather, whether or not they've experienced a disaster. They probably have experienced severe weather themselves, and they understand that as a construct far better than the complex language around climate change, of mitigation, of adaptation. They can experience the weather, and they can connect that with what might come and how they might need to better prepare. So I just encourage you to have a look at Wendy's work. And then the comments made, Isha, about social unrest. I mean, we don't measure social unrest directly in the poll, but we do ask the extent to which an individual believes that their government cares about them. And for me, this was one of the most shocking findings from the poll, that globally 37% of people around the world said to the poll that their government doesn't care about them at all. And I think that that's an absolutely huge statistic, and the repercussions of that in terms of the extent to which people are feeling disenfranchised, and then that's likely to lead on to social unrest. And remember, this is the 2021 poll, so this was, if you think back to 2021, the Delta variant of COVID was surging and receding. There were still lockdowns in certain places around the world. People were still really emerging from the pandemic. The Russia's invasion of Ukraine hadn't yet happened, and although there were signs of economic crisis coming out of COVID, the impact of inflation and global food crisis hadn't really started to take hold. And so I think this is going to be a metric to watch in our 2023 poll, and I think we can only anticipate that will go up, in addition to those measures of financial security, which will head in the other direction.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe I can abuse my position as moderator and ask a question myself. So this 2021 was the first year you asked this set of questions, and now you intend to continue every 2 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So we first polled in 2019. And so we have, in a sense, a pre-COVID baseline of some of the questions, and we did repeat some of those questions in 2021. So the questions about climate change we repeated. We've also got a series of questions called that together construct the Worry and Experience Index. So these track people's experience of and their perceptions of the risk of 7 everyday hazards. And importantly, that includes their experience of severe weather. And so we could see that between 2019 and 2021, globally, experience of severe weather rose by 5%. And we also saw a similar increase in people's experience of poor mental health as well, which we think was associated with the pandemic. And there are a handful of other questions that were also repeated. We will also repeat those questions in 2023. But yes, we decided to, because of the very positive response that we got to the Resilience Index and our Resilient World report, we decided that we didn't want to leave those out in 2023, so they are included again.
Excellent. Very interesting. That, of course, opens up another number of opportunities in terms of understanding the relation also with the actual shocks, and then the perception of the actual shocks, and then what happens over time. Very interesting. I want to give Lindsay a chance for a comment or a question. Lindsay, go on.
Thank you. No, I mean, to start with, Sarah, a huge, congratulations to you and the Gallup team. I think I'm particularly excited about, the willingness of Gallup to embrace perception-based measures of resilience. I think it's something that's, a huge avenue. I say that partly for selfish reasons. My PhD was on designing subjective measures of resilience and using mobile phones to deliver them. And I actually went into the Gallup offices in London in 2014 to actually ask or plead with them to try to include a resilience-based measure in the world poll. So I think at that time it was a little bit left field. I'm very excited that now it's eventually been adopted and used. And yeah, again, also commend you for making it public, because this information really is helpful for institutes like our own. I think Niels actually kind of stole my question, but it was more to do with the panel nature of the data, because I think from at least the work that I've done on perception-based measures, we've noticed that there is indeed a fluctuation and a correlation between kind of drops in perception-based measures of resilience and having been affected by a severe crisis. The stuff we were doing was mainly in Myanmar and looking at flood impacts, and we did see a quite a noticeable drop in people's levels of perceived resilience, both at the household level and at the community level. So, from my perspective, I would be very keen to sort of see how things, from your perspective, but more at the macro scale, how those kind of match up in terms of looking at, the impacts of things like COVID or, widespread, covariant shocks and others, how they, are affected over time using some of the panel data that you've collected. So it was more of a plea, but in that last question, it seems like it was actually addressed that hopefully you'll be included in 2023 and beyond. Because I think, from perspective of people who use that information for, kind of national and regional level measures of resilience. I think this could be really, really helpful for, for some of those efforts.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I mean, I'd certainly love to catch up with you. Outside of this meeting, you've obviously got a lot of experience of using and presumably designing the kind of questions that we've included on the poll. And although the questions are now set for 2023, we're likely to want to poll on resilience in the future. And so we're always open to, to advice from others who have expertise in this field. So, if you'd like to get in touch, we very much welcome a discussion with you.
Excellent. We have about 15 minutes left to the top of the hour. I want to go back to Joaquin and hear a bit more from you on your perspective on the operational application of some of the either data itself or the findings or the understanding we can derive from it. How do you see our potential to use this either in the financing the investment operation or the policy work that we do?
I think it's super relevant. I mean, any analytical work is always useful for us to start selecting, prioritizing where our action is going to be the most effective. No, so I think just giving the example that I liked it the most is well, everything is very good, but been working on this financial vulnerability and adaptive social protection mechanisms. I think that is a very good starting point where we don't have any data. No, so and I think taking advantage, for example, for us in you have El Salvador, if I'm not mistaken, El Salvador, Honduras, and Costa Rica. These three countries are very different in terms of financial vulnerabilities, and on the three of them, we have either a program or we are going to start a new program. We are also trying to get into supporting the social protection mechanisms for emergencies. No? We've been using them in other countries. We have been using it in the Caribbean, and the idea is to be prepared. And big part of them of the preparation effort is exactly where to start and where to prioritize. No, and I think this index gives us a very good starting point for that. That in the financial vulnerability, but I think the other aspect I think it's super relevant as well is the fact of the risk perception, the experiencing of risk. And I was very surprised to see Colombia, for example, which is a country that is affected by disasters quite often, being in the very low of the scales of the risk. So trying to understand better that positioning, and I think it is a country, for example, where we have in that case, similar to Vietnam, I will say, where the governments in the past decade have been pushing for policies on disaster risk management. And in fact, Colombia has been a leader on this. In the same way, Vietnam has been pushing the policies. And I think it will be a very good exercise for us to see, these two countries have been pushing policies agenda, but in the day-to-day, when you talk to the communities and individuals, you have a very different response. So I think that will be very interesting for me, at least, to see what is missing. And I think part of it is the communication strategies to get into that individual household and the community.
yeah, that certainly seems like a fascinating piece of research to do, almost like a couple of case studies where you look at the resilience index and then look at the broader context, the what's happening in terms of government level policy, and actually try and try and assess actually whether what's worked and what hasn't. And certainly we'd be very willing to provide access, because there's a World Risk Poll data which is freely available, and then we also have access to a whole range of other data through the World Poll that we can't make freely available because it's Gallup's IP, but nevertheless we have access to it. And so if there's some sort of partnership where we can work with your analysts and make additional data available for that case study approach, we'd be very happy to work with you on that.
I see Anna raised her hand. Anna, please come in.
Yes, no, congratulations again for the presentation, and really very glad to see this type of analysis. We did something similar in 2011 in Colombia, now that Joaquin was mentioning that. And I was wondering if when was possible to do something similar again in other countries. So I'm very pleased to have those results. I work currently in Africa. And one of the things also that we find and will be very interesting moving forward is to understand not only of the perception of the level of risk, but of who the people think is the responsibility to take action. Because this is a joint effort that involves all the society. And while the governments have, of course, a big stake on the table, and a big responsibility, also the decisions that the communities and the people individually make every day has a lot of impact in their resilience capacity. So one of the things that we are trying to identify is how they perceive themselves working towards intervening in these different factors, and not only about how they see government in action, but also how this can be a joint effort. So I would be very interested in knowing if you have some information related with that, and also if you're planning to include some future questions. I think that's something we should look into the future. And also I work in the urban context. So comparing a little bit the difference on the perception between the people living in urban areas versus people living in rural context.
Yeah, so we do have the data on urban rural, certainly, and we can also now, with the support of Gallup, actually geotag each of the individual responses with a particular algorithm that then protects the anonymity of the respondents. So yes, we have data on that. And for example, I was just looking through this before the call, that levels of community support, as you might expect, are much higher in rural areas than they are in urban. And there are lots of other findings. For example, I think the resilience index, the populations, the specific populations that have the lowest levels of resilience are women living rurally in Afghanistan, and also women. There's another factor, and I can't off the top of my head remember what it is, but also in certain areas of Africa, living rurally. So it does have a major impact. We do see that. In terms of those questions about whose responsibility it is to take action, I'm fairly sure that those questions are on our long list before we hone down the poll questions for 2021. We don't have plans to put them into the field in 2023. As I said, that's already tied up. But if you want to get in touch and let us know actually how you would use that data, we can take it forward as a candidate for consideration in the future, because what we need to do as far as possible is to design the instrument with impact in mind. And so if we know that there's a really impactful route to using the data through policy design, etc., then then we're more able to make space for it, if that makes sense. So please do get in touch with your suggestion. That'd be great.
Thanks a lot. Esha, do you have any final quick thoughts before I'll turn back to Sarah for her final comments as well before we close?
Yes, no, thank you very much. I think that was a very interesting presentation, and really glad to see this type of analysis. We did something similar in 2011 in Colombia, now that Joaquin was mentioning that. And I was wondering if when was possible to do something similar again in other countries. So I'm very pleased to have those results.
You on mute?
Apologies, still haven't learned. And what I was saying is that it would be great to actually look at the trends, with longitudinal data and see how these risk perceptions have changed over time with changes in the frequency of hazards and climatic risk as well. I think some of the telling, the things that were interesting to me also when I was looking at people's perception of risk for certain hazards, they perceived floods and cyclones and those types of very visible events that are very visceral, but not so much with drought and other silent crises that are slow and accumulative over a period of time. But we do know from research and a lot of evidence that they also have a very big impacts on the economy, just not on immediate effects, but also long-term human capital impacts from stunting to later life productivity. And so what's also interesting, I think, about the poll is this gap between perception and reality, and really seeing how those gaps change over time would be very interesting. But it's also very important for policy making to see where these gaps are the greatest, to also target interventions accordingly. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we see that with our worry and experience index, that gap between perception and actual experience, so for example, we know that people's fear of violent crime runs ahead of experience, but actually people's fear of being harmed in the workplace runs far behind experience in many countries around the world. And would be really interested again to look at the geospatial data in relation to actually, the knowledge data from the Meteorological Office, for example, about actually what's happened in particular communities, and then compare that to our our perception and experience and information from the poll. So a lot here that hasn't been done. It's a huge data set, and we do encourage you all to have a look at the data, do have a play around with the resilience index, and then to let us know how you think we could improve this, because as I said, we want to design this for impact. So if you think actually this would be great for me, if only, then please do get in touch, because we can make that happen. And as I've said, we're very committed to working in partnership with organisations that can help us to deliver impact around the world and safety.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Sarah, of course, in particular, for spending your time with us, for opening the box of treasure trove of interesting data and information that I'm sure colleagues in the World Bank will now dive into, and hopefully there will be interesting things coming out already in the coming months and years and over time. Very exciting. Thanks a lot to Esha and Joaquin for taking a particular look before this session this morning and help the rest of us dive into it. And thanks to Zoe and Simone for setting it all up, and to the rest of you for participating. And as you heard from Sarah, I think I heard an open invitation to get hold of her. If you are particularly interested in any new questions, additional questions, any other comments, so I do think you all have an open invitation to engage. Please do. I think you can find her contact information. Otherwise, contact me or Zoe or Simone, and we'll be happy to connect you. And with that, I would like to close this session this morning here on the US East Coast. Wish you all a fantastic day, and thanks again for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.